So hello and welcome to the first panel. I would first like to pass the word to President Ilves, and I would like to ask you, how would you scope the problem of securing elections in a digital era? How do you think democracies can work better together to address election interference? And last but not least, how do you think we could close the transatlantic rift in protecting liberal democracies? Please.
You want me to do that in 7 minutes? Well, first of all, let me start saying that we can only really talk about election interference when we're dealing with democracies. And it's also not just about elections. The whole point of interference is to achieve a political effect. As von Clausewitz says, war is the continuation of policy by other means. And when you are the adversary of a democracy, you say, oh, well, here's something where you can continue war by other means. Before you had democracies, obviously, you didn't affect elections. And so this leads to a unique situation, which is that any kind of attempts to manipulate democracy is, first of all, asymmetric. That is to say, you can't, they can do it to you, you can't do it to them. And then the problem of reciprocity or reciprocal response is highly problematic, since what is it that you can do if someone attacks your democracy? And so basically, if you can't do election interference to an undemocratic adversary, I mean, let's be honest, what are you going to do to change the results in any way, possible way, in either Russia or Belarus or any of the other autocratic, non-democratic regimes that democracy deals with? One of the things we have to realize is that the spectrum of activity is amazingly wide when it comes to what we call election interference. I would prefer to call it democracy interference, because you don't have to just go after elections. And in fact, when we look at the influence operations that we've seen, I mean, they are year-round perhaps with the goal of changing the results of an election, which would then lead to a change in policy. But when we talk about election interference, people still tend to think of what it is that you do on or around election day, not that it is a constant, persistent activity that is year-round. Now, if we look at the use of, if we look at interference in democratic elections, it has a long history that goes back, I mean, I guess in a major way back to 100 years ago, when we started to see attempts to affect elections by the Bolsheviks. And I mean, some people claim even earlier, but in any case, but all of this was limited by technology. That, I mean, you did not have wide distribution networks. You couldn't get to people really. I mean, I remember 40 years ago, there would be some guy in a street corner at Columbia University selling the Daily Worker, which no one ever bought. It wasn't very effective, obviously. And if you look historically at the attempts of disinformation, really the classic case is in 1985 or so, the Soviets tried to start a rumor in a provincial communist newspaper in India that the CIA invented AIDS, which then over a series of months made it to Germany and was finally was laundered into the mainstream press there. Now, you don't have to do that anymore. today, all of you can not only do mass distribution of fake stories and disinformation, you can also do micro-targeting. And we saw in the case already of the 2016 election in the United States, but even earlier, I think, and maybe Marietje can talk about it, with the association agreement for Ukraine in 2015, certainly we saw various kinds of misinformation, disinformation, information laundering, and also on a targeted basis already in the Brexit election. So this has become part of our political reality, and one that we have to deal with. Now that's one kind of election interference. When we talk about election interference, however, it goes all the way to the other end of a broad spectrum, which at its most specific actually involves manipulating the numbers, hacking the numbers that go into, that ultimately are tabulated for votes. And we have seen attempts even at that. And so as a result, we have people in the past several years saying, oh, we must do paper balloting, and paper ballots are the only way to have secure elections. I wish that were true, because first of all, you're not even taking into account the digital social media environment that we're talking about. But even when it comes to elections today, or when we do elections today, we naively think that voting digitally means that you, in the case of the United States, there's a voting machine that you press a button on, or in the case of Estonia, we have a very secure system that you use to vote over the internet. But in fact, since the computerization of the electoral process beginning already in the 1980s, from the very beginning, which is the voter list, though that is kind of a unique problem of the United States, that they have something that you have to register to vote. Voting should be a right for all citizens, and the idea of if you're a citizen, you should have the right to vote. But in the United States, you have voter registration. We already know that at least, depending on who you ask, in 2016, either 21 or 39 states had their voting lists breached in the United States. The 39 number comes from was a secret report from the NSA, for which a person went to jail. But we don't know, based on what was released, whether anyone affected voting rolls. But even there, you can already manipulate an election. If you start changing or removing names, people then cannot vote. And then so that's already one end of the spectrum. On the other end, skipping over the actual voting, the entire tabulation and adding up results from precincts to districts to up to the final results in an election, that too can be manipulated digitally by simply hacking into it. So what we'll be spending, I guess, a lot of time today on is using digital means in elections, but in fact, we forget in all of our discussions how vulnerable the entire process can be without truly secure systems that are both in terms of software and hardware. And I've heard various people over the years talk about, how do you do this? How do you have secure elections? Someone could change your vote, when in fact there's so much you can change in the electoral process, and we are not going to go away from using digital and electronic means. That I think we should turn the focus of our electoral security in the case of the actual voting process, far more to hardening the systems with two-factor authentication and with end-to-end encryption and other things like that people don't think about at all, using distributed ledgers, also known as blockchain, to guarantee data integrity, which has not been used very much. All of these methods are there to guarantee electoral integrity, but we should stop talking about, oh my God, we have to use paper ballots. We have disinformation, targeted disinformation. We have attacks on the actual integrity of the electoral system, all of which is possible. That was my timer. All of which is possible only because of the digital era. And then we have finally, which I didn't get into, but more traditionally means that you can simply buy votes, buy candidates. These are all ways of, to go back to von Clausewitz, to affect policy by other means. And that's what is going on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Ilves. Marietje, you have been dealing and thinking about election security, both in your time in the European Parliament as well as now from the Stanford University. What do you think, what is the role of the government, the political parties, and also individual politicians in taking responsibility about issues such as defining elections as a critical infrastructure, in transparency, in party financing, and political advertising? And also, what do you think is the responsibility of the private sector, of the big tech companies vis-à-vis fighting disinformation? Are they doing enough or not? Please.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm so happy to join you for this really important discussion. I think we've seen some real-time playing out of risk and the impact of an erosion of trust in the electoral process. And it's still ongoing in the United States. And so I think every government, every society cannot be early enough in trying to make sure that there is trust and resiliency in their systems. So the way I like to think about roles and responsibilities when it comes to maintaining trust and security in the democratic process is as an ecosystem. So I believe that there are indeed a number of technical and cybersecurity aspects, but that there's an entire spectrum then that links together the platforms where the public debate and the political debate take place, the different actors that are involved, as you mentioned, whether they are in government, in the private sector, or in political parties, in the media, in society at large. And so one of the important challenges, I think, is to see the tension between these cybersecurity aspects and the debate itself. I was reading up on the latest that happened overnight in the United States this morning and noticed that Chris Krebs, who has just been fired from the US government for pushing back against deliberate disinformation about the electoral process, while his office and team and he himself were responsible for securing, from a cybersecurity point of view, the elections, and do not feel that any of the claims of disinformation are substantiated. And so there's a real clash between, on the one hand, the cybersecurity actors taking their responsibility, and then the disinformation, which, contrary to 2016, is not coming necessarily from foreign actors, is not easily labeled as foreign meddling, but is coming from within. And not just from within American society, but from the very highest office in American politics. And so I think it's important to make a stronger connection and to look into the interaction between those technical questions, which were often seen as the domain of experts, the domain of intelligence services, certs, cybersecurity experts, but not so much for all of society, simply because not every person has the agency to be responsible to secure an election as such. It does require that expertise, that mandate to take such important actions. But a number of those are limited in their trust-building effect when concerted disinformation campaigns continue to attack the trust in liberal democracy in a way that at the end of the day may continue to have effect, even if there is no reason for mistrust. So what this American example shows is how this is a dynamic field. Lessons learned from 2016 did not apply one-on-one to 2020. And I'm sure a lot of new insights will still have to be glanced from what has happened in this year and what continues to happen, whether it's disinformation campaigns against Hispanics in Florida and other states, whether it is the appearance of ghost candidates on ballot papers in Florida to divide, for example, the Democratic vote to advantage the positions of Republican candidates. There's a lot that still needs to be uncovered, and unfortunately this independent research, and I hear a lot of complaints about this from my colleagues at Stanford, independent research, so insight and oversight, are not helped by a lack of transparency provided by the big tech companies. You asked about the role of companies, and I think that simply being the platform, creating the conditions for access to information, a public debate, who gets to pay for play when it comes to pushing their messages, how easily can they be manipulated, are all areas that really require deeper research in the public interest. The fact that we don't know more about cause and effect, about information online and behavior offline, is actually harmful for the public interest and democracy as such. The fact that commercial and advertising companies play such an outsized role in our political and public debate, I believe, deserves more scrutiny. And so what you see in all of these examples is that safeguarding these processes, having rules in place that President Ilves also mentioned, whether it's campaign financing, whether it's transparency and accountability, whether it is cybersecurity, stress testing, commitments to not using certain tactics. It is much better to have these rules and standards in place in a non-partisan way before the polarization gets too deep, before the erosion of trust has already happened as a result of disinformation. Because illustrated over and over again, and I think most tellingly in the United States, once this deep polarization and erosion of trust takes hold, it's not only harder to convince people how important this is and that it's not a weapon against the success of one party or another to put in place stronger protections of the democratic process. But now, politically, it will become harder because everything is seen through the lens of the success of one side over the failure of the other side, even though obviously all citizens and all parties should have a high stake in protecting the elections, both from attacks from the outside, from commercial models pushing against democratic principles, or the erosion from within. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer more questions, and thanks for having me this morning.
Much for adding your deep thoughts in this and for elaborating indeed on the role of big companies. Building on that and building on what you mentioned, how important the role of technology is, Liisa, can you expand a little bit more on these issues? What do you think is the role of technology in elections? And perhaps could you walk us through the different stages in electoral procedures? And last but not least, what and whose responsibility is it, to your mind, to do a comprehensive risk assessment of elections?
Thank you. And I couldn't have a better setup to talk about comprehensive risk and what comprehensive risk assessment looks like, both in terms of technology and the overall elections ecosystem, than the two previous speakers. Now, as everyone so far has emphasized, this is about free, fair and open elections based on the one person, one vote principle, regardless of the way you vote, regardless of the way you tally votes, and regardless of the way the election organizer publishes and broadcasts the result of the votes. And we're dealing with it at the time where the public square, the central idea, the marketplace of ideas, the central idea of a democratic system, particularly in the US, that's very debates and local gatherings and big rallies based, is impossible, or at least you have to pick between democracy and public health, a choice that you don't easily want to make. Similarly, since arguably 100 years ago, but definitely since the events in Ukraine in 2014 and the presidential campaigns in France and the United States in 2016, we know that it's an adversary that's reactive and opportunistic, that's looking to delegitimize any part of the election life cycle rather than to corrupt the integrity of a single vote or corrupt the integrity of a single part of the system. It's about creating doubt, confusion, and alienating thus the voters from their democracy and creating the sense of, well, it's all dirty, so why do I bother? And we've seen a live demonstration of that in the last 5 or 6 years. So elections across the world, and even in various US states, are incredibly varied. And they rely on digital technology in various parts of the election life cycle. And it's important to know and notice that no particular technology, after all, pen and paper is a form of analog technology, is more or less secure than the other inherently. But it's rather about how you manage it and how you deploy it. So, as some election managers have found out, introducing electronic voter lists that don't in real time or close to real time check voter eligibility is a really bad idea. However, introducing electronic voter lists that do cross-reference with voter eligibility and with population registry data is a really good idea. So it's about how you check and balance technology. And it's about introducing technology where it most helps to avoid risks. Now, when you introduce any technology, do you log network traffic? Do you log every step of the process? Do you have proper access control? We know that in the physical world, we're pretty good about perimeter control. We tape and seal the ballot box. We have understanding of what the voting booth looks like. We know what the polling station looks like. But then how do you make sure that the same constitutional principles of free, fair, open elections that are in some way transparent and or observable, and where double voting or triple voting is avoided, so one person, one vote principle is preserved, how do you transit to that becomes the central question. And the way an election organizer should think about risk management, therefore, is to start with keeping the house in order and then moving outwards. I think of it as concentric circles, where the first central element of election integrity in any way of voting in a democracy, the caveat of President Ilves is ever so important here, is making sure that both the voters' political will is accurately recorded and that they believe that it's accurately recorded. So it's both the action and the what it looks like. And whether you do that using pen and paper and the ballot box, then it's observable for the person that they place their vote in a ballot box. Whether you do it in postal voting, as a large part of the world does, again, how do you ensure secrecy of the vote whilst also ensuring reasonable traceability and observability? Do you treat the postal system as a black box, or do you scan the outer envelope when you have a double envelope ensuring the secrecy of the vote? Do you scan the outer envelope at different stages of the postal delivery process, as a large part of the US election organizers now do? Again, how would you introduce technology in a way that enhances security rather than risks it? So once the voting process has been secured, the next stage of risk management is that of election technology. Technology specific to election, but not to do with necessarily the process of casting the vote themselves. No, that might be a comprehensive election information system of the kind that both Estonia and, for example, Finland uses, where every stage of the election life cycle, from the registration of candidates, the voter list, through to publication of results, is in a singular information system that's been developed for that custom purpose, to specific applications, be it electronic poll books for voter lists or something else. And only when voting itself has been taken care of can you start to manage risks in the wider sort of election technology ecosystem, taking care that the constitutional requirements on elections are continuously fulfilled. Using the specific electronic opportunities to do so. I mentioned logging, I mentioned network segmentation, things that enhance security rather than risk it. Then the third element, and that's where we've seen most breaches and most attempts to attack elections, is the facilitators. That technology that facilitates participation in democracy and elections, whether it's the websites of parties and candidates, whether it's how we converse, and also I would include media in that. And I think that's where, during the pandemic and post-pandemic, we need to see most development, not just in terms of risk management and security, but also development of technology. We know that during pandemic and quite possibly post-pandemic, the public square that I mentioned, the way we discuss in a democracy might not be possible ever again in quite the same way. Not everyone, not every citizen will feel comfortable coming together in these many conversations that are so central to Western democracies. So whilst the one-to-many, the broadcast model, has good technical solutions, whether it's cable news, whether it's something along the lines of what we're doing today, whether it's online videos, there's good solutions for that. The many conversations that are central to our understanding of politics in a democratic governance need to be figured out. Which leads me to the fourth and final level of managing risks, which is that of the information environment. Both Marietje and Toomas Hendrik mentioned many of the challenges, and it truly is an integrity challenge. How do we make sure that citizens trust democratic governance? How do we make sure that they're critical readers and critical writers also of their own texts? Because in the end, elections are fundamentally about delegating trust. It's delegating trust in the fundamental way of delegating your part in governance to a candidate that hopefully goes on to win the elections and be elected to their desired office. But also the processes are about delegating trust. On a fundamental level in electoral proceedings, we delegate trust to the elections organizers, and on the very top level to Judge Kask, who's in the audience today and who offered his opening remarks. And countries have had centuries in the luckier cases, and decades in the less lucky cases, such as us in Estonia, to practice delegating trust face-to-face, paper-to-paper. And it's hard conceptually to delegate trust to complex mathematics, particularly since we live in a world where mathematics are unnecessarily over-mystified starting in elementary school. So for many people, trust me, I'm government is easier in terms of the cognitive process than trust me, I'm complex mathematics. And that's to what we're delegating part of trust in election technology, regardless of where technology is deployed. And at the time where technology will need to continue to be deployed safely, particularly in balancing democracy and public health.
Thank you, Liisa. Absolutely, I can't agree more. But building on this, I'd like to sort of like to warm up for the whole panel for the discussion. Ask you all, and then go to the more deeper Q&A that the audience has been providing us. And thank you for that, and thank you for voting in various questions. So this webinar takes place in a wake of the US presidential election, which is an election where the voter and the electoral officials have been challenged by a global pandemics, as well as systematic voter suppression and lack of trust in electoral process, just as you, Liisa, mentioned. What do you think, how to balance between election and public health? Is internet voting the solution in this, or is it complicating things and bearing the trust very thin? President Ilves, would you like to start us off in that? I think you're muted. I can't hear you. I hope others, I suspect. Yes, now it's better.
All right. Let me just say a few quick things, because I want to release a question for Q&A. First of all, I think the US is almost a special case. And we forget, first of all, the disinformation and disruption of democratic processes, including elections, takes place all over the democratic world, but because the United States outsized power and place in society, everyone focuses on the US election. Secondly, I would say that the US probably has one of the worst electoral systems anywhere in the world. It is stuck in the pre-modern first past the post system, which is a distortion of democracy, and which we have seen in its worst cases in the past 20 years, twice, when in fact the popular vote ran against the electoral college vote, which is disproportional and first past the post. When it comes to doing elections digitally, which is a very good idea in an era of COVID or whatever else comes in the future, I think Liisa has made this point over the years, over and over, that it works, but it has to work in a larger ecosystem in which you actually use the same digital tools for all kinds of interactions. And in fact, in Estonia, all but 3 interactions involving the government can be done online. And especially, if you've been doing all your bank transactions using the same end-to-end encryption, 2-factor authentication system, and do it daily or weekly, then voting is not something that instills fear. Whereas if you have a specific system used only once every 2.5 years, or 3 times within 5 years, as most elections are in Europe, you're not going to trust it. So the trust part requires actually digitization of everything else, not digitization of the electoral system. And finally, when it comes to electoral integrity, you can, of course, maybe find someday cases in which it's been abused digitally. But compared to all of the votes bought with money, the old Chicago vote early and often, which is an expression that's over 100 years old, And finally, I mean, in my country, we even had people buying votes in a traditional setting for a bottle of vodka. So I think that we can kind of tone down the fear about the digital side, where I think we're far more adept and capable of finding electoral irregularities than we are with the people who are voting for parties that are against digital elections.
Thanks. Marietje, would you like to add at this point, or shall we just go on with other questions?
Well, maybe just a brief remark that I agree that the difference in the systems of organizing elections are very, very important to even assess the viability of digitizing the voting process. So in the United States, it's highly decentralized with about 10,000 different districts that organize the process in their own way with legacy technologies and no real ability to streamline or standardize so far. And I would only imagine that doing such an effort now is hard because of the political polarization. And the question of trust is resting on many more aspects than just the democratic process. So the country I know best, the Netherlands, we vote with a red pencil and a piece of paper. But of course, at the end of the day, the votes tallied and aggregated end up in some automated or digital form in an Excel spreadsheet or on a website. And all of that is trusted because there's general trust in society, which is built, by many different steps and actors and legal provisions. So generally, I would say what's much more important is to have a verifiable voting process. And whether it's digital or analog doesn't matter as much, but it seems to me that technology normally cannot, in and of itself, replace the lack of trust in democracy or democratic process. So we cannot expect magical improvements of trust by just changing it into an online or digital voting process.
Thank you. And I'd like to also thank everybody who's been watching us on Workshop and asking questions there and voting for their questions. So in an attempt to expand this discussion a little bit beyond the US elections, I'd like to encourage people who are watching us to ask and participate in this discussion. I'll read out the first question and I'd ask you, Liisa, to take the first look at it. So our audience would like to ask a question about blockchain elections. Could you tell us, is it possible to organize blockchain elections in developing countries? A little bit, this is a continuation somewhat of the same debate, but still takes it further.
So distributed ledger is one of the ghosts that haunts information security from all corners and aspects since blockchain became hype a while ago. And distributed ledger is great, as President Ilves pointed out, in ensuring information or data integrity in systems where no central authority of trust exists. However, elections rely on a central election authority in most cases. So in terms of the fundamental organization of elections, distributed ledger blockchain technology currently would have the rather limited uses in integrity, and of course in integrity of the wider information ecosystem. There's a lot more uses, but it's really appropriate where there's questions of central trust, whether it's in transitional times or whether it's in non-binding, non-central, non-national elections. And it might also have uses in verification. Marietje mentioned verification just now, where verification or verifiability of election isn't one smooth silver bullet process, but it's rather a coming together of two opposite ends of a process where there's the personal verification. Now, the moment I drop my ballot into a ballot box, I can no longer personally verify it. Similarly, I can only digitally verify that my vote has been passed to the second stage. But without breaching vote secrecy, I can't verify that it's been counted accurately, which is where what we call universal verifiability comes in. And again, there's particular distributed ledger solutions there for vote verification.
Thanks. President Ilves, you wanted to comment on this as well.
I want to say that, well, we shouldn't get into a technical argument here, but I would say that a permissioned ledger with a limited number of authorities, I mean, is not a decentralized system. I would say that I view it as supply chain integrity maintenance rather than, you don't vote on blockchain. That's not the whole, I mean, I don't know who asked the question, but you don't vote on blockchain. It is that you can use distributed ledger systems to do the same kind of supply chain integrity control as you do in, say, buying or getting vaccine for COVID, which is you have to make sure that in no step of the process was there any kind of interference. But you don't vote on blockchain. You vote as you vote, but you can use distributed ledger, a permission distributed ledger that is with a limited number of authorities, not everybody doing it like in Bitcoin, but rather a limited number. Election authority can, in fact, be the ones that control and check up on the integrity of the entire voting chain, beginning from voting lists to the final tabulation.
Thanks. We have a passionate discussion on the Q&A regarding not just the US elections and blockchain, but also about the debate going on about trust in elections here in Estonia. So I will take a number of questions that address the same issue, and I'd like you to comment on those. And sorry, Marietje, about these questions being Estonia specific. However, I think that there are some general issues hidden there in this debate that go beyond Estonia. So I'll read out some of the questions. After the last Estonian parliamentary elections, one of the winning party, Conservative People's Party, became critical of e-voting and its cybersecurity issues. Later, the party minister gathered an e-election task force group, and one of their proposals was that more resources should be made available so that several independent auditors can check the process of e-voting. Now comes the question. In your opinion, are these kinds of thorough audits raising trust, especially in case of one political party that has suspicion towards the specific voting channel, internet? A more general question on the same issue. How has Estonia managed to maintain trust in elections during the ID card problem? And a question also about the Estonian iVoting system is generally seen as secure, but is not understood very well by the population that uses it. How can we communicate the functioning of the system more usefully so that people can trust it? So, bunch of questions, not easy. Liisa, would you try to sort of like tackle some of them?
I'll give it a stab, and I think they're not as Estonia specific as they sound. You know, here around this virtual discussion table, we have the most and least digital of European elections, Estonia and the Netherlands. Ironically, and I think the issue of trust is very much, the mechanisms of trust are very much the same. First of all, it is about technical communication and legal communication. A lot of election procedures are legal procedures that sound quite technical regardless of what their domain is. And there's a fundamental question of how the lawyers having learned to communicate in an understandable way. The technologists need to do the same. And frankly, the technologists also need to take another step and take their knowledge into legal education. We have an Estonian court ruling that in its oversimplified way says, listen, you need to make this more understandable to lawyers. And that goes to iVoting. Then on the audit and testing, the auditing of election results is fundamental in systems such as the US, where not all votes get double count. In Estonia, paper votes are counted twice, by hand, and then, because we have a very simple ballot. And digital votes are tabulated twice also on 2 consecutive days. So I think the audit and testing question is right, but I think it also needs to happen earlier. Independent audit of the code base of the software in election technology is more valuable than auditing the results. Testing and independent testing, again, of the technology, both in terms of functional testing, does it do what it's supposed to do, and also non-functional testing, so security testing and penetration testing, the different elements, is more important, because that way we'll catch issues before they happen. And my Finnish colleagues, if you allow me a very brief promotional break, wrote an excellent contribution into the European Union Compendium on election security, on testing, and how do you think structurally about testing election technology. And finally, on the ID card issue, I think the main lesson was of aggressive transparency there. For those who are not familiar with the case, Estonia got notification less than 2 months before elections, local elections in 2017. It's one of my war stories, so it feels like yesterday, of a vulnerability in the crypto library of the firmware of the ID card. So something that we couldn't technically mitigate, but had to find a way around of the vulnerability in a fundamental facilitator of the ecosystem. And it's really a case where I was at the time Chief Research Officer at the Information System Authority. We went to the Election Commission within a few working days of going public and finding out. And we said, listen, there's a risk. At this point, it's a race of timelines, and we can't quantify the likelihood of us having a fix before there being an exploit that could bring down the ecosystem. We're working on it, and currently it's a theoretical, mathematical, hypothetical, cryptographical risk, using all of those words. And we went in, frankly, thinking that we'll come out with internet voting being cancelled, because that's our job as risk managers was to try to understand the possible detrimental effect of the risk. And that's where the distribution of roles in norm and in law kicked in, because at the time the chairman of the National Elections Commission looked at us and said, I understand what you're saying, but we're lawyers and we don't deal in the hypotheticals, and said that very publicly and very transparently. Come back when there is an incident, come back when you can quantify the risk. And that's a great case study of the different roles to check each other, kicking in the way they're intended to.
Thank you, Liisa. Marietje, sorry, yeah.
I mean, two things I want to say, just so people know that what is being referred to was, to be very blunt, it was a flaw that was in the chip by the chip maker, who did not inform the country. So this has nothing to do with the electoral system. It is a flaw in the chip that also is used in the highest level credit cards. So this was a chip flaw. The other thing on the question of the populist party, this is a far right party. We're not dealing with a party that you normally find in democracies. Everyone, they don't know what digital voting is about, except for the one minister who got fired, who was part of this government coalition, who just published an article saying that digital voting works. So what we do have is people who do not understand tech at all, making a populist point and dragging down the reputation of our electoral system for their populist points, but who could not even know nothing about digital affairs, except for the one person in the party coalition that does, who said that electoral voting works fine. So I don't think we should even take anything they say seriously anymore, given the level of non-expertise that I hear from those people. Pardon me for the partisan intervention, but I really dislike ignorance.
Fair enough. Marietje, is there anything you would like to comment on these issues? I mean, don't feel as if we are trying to drag you into the domestic political issue, but I think trust that is being touched here, and the issue of explaining complicated things to people so that the trust from the electoral process doesn't erode, is something that is not, as Liisa very correctly said, not just specific to Estonia, but characteristic to all the countries, and the need to be transparent about issues, about risks, and yet the need to take bold decisions at critical times is something that politicians, statesmen, and all of us at the end of the day need to do all. Let's continue with the questions. The main questions on the Q&A session here, yes, touched about Estonia. There's one which is more technical. During the physical elections, you can see voter alone in the voting booth. How can you ensure that during an electronic election via internet, how do we ensure that the vote is personal? Liisa.
That question is right on, because in remote voting, whether it's by mail, electronic or otherwise, you have less control of the environment. So you need to mitigate for that using other means. There isn't a good mitigation in postal voting that I know anywhere in the world. And what Estonia has done for the remote electronic voting, so for internet voting, is to de-incentivize and demotivate those trying to coerce the voter or to buy votes by allowing the voter to cast their vote as however many times with only the last vote counting, meaning that there's no longer sense in coercing them or in influencing them, since they can go back and the moment the person influencing them has left, recast their vote. And they can also recast it in early voting on paper, and then the paper takes priority over the digital. So Estonia in digital voting has mitigated that exact question, the lack of controlled environment, by allowing multiple voting where only last vote counts.
Thank you. We don't have much time left, but there is enough for one remaining question and a sort of final remarks or thoughts you would like to leave the audience with. We've been discussing a lot about how the various national issue of elections and political elections indeed are deeply national issue. But how much room is there for cooperation and multinational efforts? Marietje, back in December 2018, I believe, you wrote about the need for EU to have election meddling stress tests to measure the security and resilience on election infrastructure and technologies. Do you think this is still relevant at the European level? And Liisa, I recall back you mentioned casually, but I think this deserves still advertisement, the effort that you led back in 2018, the endeavor to gather best practices from 20 plus EU countries on cybersecurity of election technology. This compendium, although 2 years old, I think it still is interesting and relevant. Is there a follow-up, or where do you think, all of you, where do you think EU is today with election resilience at this multinational efforts level? Marietje.
Yeah, so I think we see over and over again that democracy is only as strong as its weakest link. And in the EU, unfortunately, we have plenty of examples where once a less democratic or explicitly illiberal democratic, to the extent that that's a concept at all, but illiberal government comes in, it pulls down the democratic ability and credibility of the whole union. And the same can be said for the United States. You know, if one state or district can successfully be flipped, it can have a ripple effect throughout the entire United States. And so, of course, it is important to have a minimum standard across the European Union, and also the ability to not only trust but verify. And therefore, I think stress tests and having minimum benchmarks and an ability to transparently, as you mentioned previously, be aware and on that basis inform citizens of how the systems work to advance their rights, not to forget, I believe is crucial. So yes, I don't think that the EU is where it should be yet in order to ensure democratic resilience. And the same goes for fighting back against disinformation and other malign campaigns, including through the business models of the big tech corporations. So this is a work in progress that probably never ends. And maybe that's also something people should be aware of, that making sure that the democratic process is not undermined is something that requires work, and we can never sit back and expect that things will be fine if we don't defend our principles.
Thank you. Liisa.
There's, the minimum effort, and that's being done, is to update the best practice and to share the best practice. However, actual operational security of elections and information sharing around that is where Europe can really learn from the United States, whether it's through the learning and scaling for Europe, the efforts of Chris Krebs' team at Department of Homeland Security, or whether it's the work of Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center run by the Center for Internet Security, that are fundamentally focused on actionable, operational, real-time or close to real-time advice. So that you don't all make the same mistakes at once. And if not before, then in the next European Parliament elections in less than 4 years. That's when Europe has such a unique opportunity to build up, having close to 30 elections nationally in less than a week is when you can come together and build up that real-time or close to real-time alert information sharing and actionable alert clearinghouse. I think that's, if we fail at that, why do we even bother?
Thank you. President Ilves, do you have last thoughts that you would like to leave us with?
Well, briefly, I think that what we do need to do is, which I didn't raise before, but I'll just say, given that at least in terms of external actors manipulating elections, it's a limited number of entities doing this. I mean, they call them what you want, but APT 28, APT 29, the IRA in Petersburg, the so-called Internet Research Agency, and they have been active in different ways in virtually every liberal democracy in Europe and North America. Unless we start cooperating far more between nations and among nations, we will, all of us, be more or less alone dealing with this. I find it sad and disappointing that the European Union and also NATO have not really addressed these issues more seriously, appealing to mandate restrictions. And I know in the case of especially NATO that, we can study this if it's attacking NATO, but if it's if they're attacking someone else, we can't. So we're wasting resources and we're not cooperating enough. And since what we share is democracy, what they share are a limited number of actors destroying democracy. The liberal democracies in Europe and in North America should be cooperating far more on dealing with these, be it the attacks on the integrity of the digital system or the attacks that we see through disinformation. Without far closer cooperation between and among nations, we will be, as it were, hanging separately.
Thank you. Thank you all for this very thought-invigorating discussion. I would like to really thank my panel in this and remind us all that while we are warmed up in discussion, don't leave the screens yet, as we have a second panel to follow, moderated by Professor Robert Krimmer, Professor of E-Governance at the Tartu University. So thank you. I think what we've learned and realized is that when it comes to elections and political participation, elections represent something that countries have in common, yet it also differentiates the countries because the way the elections are being organized are different in each country. Yet again, there is need to do more together. Thank you.